Hi everyone! I wanted to give you a brief introduction to Chapter 24 and some of the major topics in Chapter 24, which is called On the Origin of Species, but really is about these major topics of species and speciation. So, what is a species? And this thinking about the actual origin of species. Where do species come from? So, the process of speciation is the process by which one species becomes or splits into two or more species. And it may seem kind of intuitive, right, what a species is, but if you try to start to describe it, it can get really difficult. So a species is typically thought of as a kind or a type. And there's lots of different ways you can group organisms, right? You can group them by biochemistry, you can group them by DNA sequences, you can group them by morphology, you can group them by behavior. And so all of these things and more go into what the definition of a species is, right? So here is a bunch of Darwin's finches. And how do we say when this large cactus finch here is a different species than this large ground finch? They look pretty similar. One has a little bit bigger beak, right? But all of these things go into what is considered a species. And so it's actually not a simple concept, and one that's a source of arguments between a lot of scientists. Okay, so there's others, the most common species concept, the most common way to define a species is a species being a group of populations whose members have potential to reproduce in nature and produce fertile offspring. And so this is about the potential to reproduce, not actual reproduction. Okay. And so this sort of gives us a place to start, at least, thinking about this, because we have some similarities between different species, right? Here's two different species of meadowlarks here in figure A that if you start looking at them, they look really similar, right? They both have this black chest patch, they're both yellow, and probably, unless you are an excellent birder, you might not be able to tell the difference by looking at these two species. In fact, some species are defined only based on this, the fact that they can't reproduce with each other, and that they have slightly different DNA. So sometimes you can have two species that are really similar. Sometimes you can have one species that is really, really diverse, like humans. Lots and lots and lots of phenotypic differences between us. Um, and so there certainly are plenty of similarities, right? But how do you say when one species is different than another? Okay. And so this is probably the most common definition is this fact that, okay, we're all humans because we all could reproduce with each other. Not saying we all will. All right. So this species concept, the biological one, requires reproductive isolation to go from one species to two species. And reproductive isolation can take lots of different forms, but essentially it's biological factors that prevent two species from producing viable fertile offspring. And so when two species do breed and produce offspring, that's called a hybrid. So this is the result of mating two different species, a hybrid. They're typically not fertile, at least under the biological species concept. Okay, so if we've got a lion, we've got a tiger, and different matings between lions and tigers can give us ligers and tigons, which, while very cute, are not fertile. Okay, so you need offspring that are a result of a mating, and the offspring have to be fertile. Okay. Okay. So reproductive isolation can occur by a whole bunch of different barriers, and if you are interested, you can definitely look into some more of these because there's lots of them, right? So they could be physically different. They could be temporary isolated, meaning that they don't breed at the same time of year. There's mechanical isolation where the copulatory organs just don't fit together. Okay, so animals might try to breed, right, but they can't. Or animals might not breed at all if their behavior is differently timed. That's the example here with these skunks. So there's a striped skunk and a spotted skunk here in C and D, and they could breed, theoretically. If you put the sperm and eggs together of these two animals, there would be an offspring. But they are isolated from each other because they breed at different times of the year. So you would never have a striped skunk breeding with a spotted skunk. And all the ones on this side are called prezygotic barriers, meaning that they're before the zygote forms. So before the egg and sperm meet and form a zygote. Okay? The postzygotic barriers are after. So sometimes animals can mate, different species can mate, a zygote can form, but there's some options here that prevent them from creating the viable offspring, the fertile offspring. So maybe the hybrid isn't viable. Maybe that zygote doesn't make it and is not actually born. There's examples where the hybrid is infertile, and that's really famous in the horse and donkey example, that when a horse and a donkey create a hybrid offspring, it's called a mule, and they are not fertile. Or hybrid breakdown, where the hybrid might form, but is going to be breaking down over its lifetime and not live as long. Okay, so there's lots of prezygotic barriers and some postzygotic barriers that create this reproductive isolation that is necessary for two different species to maintain the two different species. Okay, and so I mentioned this is one species concept. So there's limitations, right? We can't apply this biological species concept of based on mating to anything that's self-fertilizing, like a lot of plants, or anything that reproduces asexually. Plenty of animals, plenty of fungi, right? So this is really difficult because if an animal can breed with itself, how are you then talking about different species? Yeah. And the other problem or other limitation of this concept is that it requires a lack of gene flow. But we just said gene flow can occur between morphologically and ecologically distinct species. So we've got grizzly bears, we've got polar bears. They can form a hybrid called a growler bear. And this is a hybrid, right? So this is not showing lack of gene flow. There's gene flow. There's genes moving or combining between these two different species. So how do we bring that into our biological species concept? Ducks do this all the time. Ducks in California, all different kinds of hybridized ducks. Well, they're different species, right? There's a redhead duck and a canvasback duck, but they form hybrid offspring that are viable and that are fertile. So again, once you start looking into the species concept stuff, there's lots of different ways to define species, and lots of them are very contentious. And so scientists will definitely argue about species and species concepts all day long, but at least it gives us a framework to start thinking about how we classify diversity of organisms. Okay, that's it for today. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.